The woman stumbled through the riverside willows, her silk dress torn and mud-stained, blood trailing from her bare feet. And when she finally collapsed into the shallow water, a Modoc hunter named Lokni found her there, half-drowned and whispering that she couldn't go on, that she was lost. And without a word he lifted her into his bullboat and began the long journey home. The Klamath River ran cold and swift through Northern California territory, carving its path between pine-covered mountains and volcanic rock formations that had witnessed centuries of passage. The year was 1872, and the land still bore scars from the Modoc War, a conflict that had left both sides wary and wounded. The river itself seemed to remember, its current carrying whispers of old battles and older truths that would never be spoken aloud in the white settlements downstream. Lokni had been tracking elk for 3 days, moving upstream through territory he knew as well as his own heartbeat. He was 29, lean and strong, with hands that could weave a fish trap or string a bow with equal skill. His people had lived along these waters since time before memory, reading the river's moods like some men read books, understanding its language in ways that couldn't be taught, only learned through generations of listening. The bullboat rested on the shore, where he'd left it that morning, its willow frame covered in buffalo hide, circular and sturdy, designed to navigate shallow rapids and deep pools alike. He'd built it himself 2 summers ago, following the old ways his grandfather had taught him before the soldiers came and changed everything. The craft was small but reliable, perfect for one man traveling alone through country that didn't always welcome his kind. He'd learned to move quietly through a world that had grown loud with suspicion and anger, where his face alone could spark fear or violence in those who didn't understand that he wanted nothing more than to live in peace. The forest stretched in all directions, thick with Douglas fir and ponderosa pine, their branches heavy with the scent of resin and rain. Moss grew on the north sides of trunks in thick carpets of green, and the undergrowth rustled with the passage of small creatures that knew to stay hidden during daylight hours when predators hunted. The sun hung low over the western ridge. When he first heard the sound, cutting through the constant whisper of wind and water, at first he thought it was a wounded animal, the kind of desperate noise that pain makes when it can't be contained anymore, when the body has given up trying to hide its suffering. He paused mid-step, his hand moving instinctively to the knife. At his belt, the bone handle smooth and familiar against his palm. The forest had taught him caution over the years, and the last few seasons had reinforced those lessons with blood and loss. But curiosity pulled him forward, and something else too. Something that felt like the tug of fate or the hand of the spirits his grandmother used to speak of around winter fires. The sound came again, weaker this time, almost swallowed by the river's constant voice and the evening songs of birds settling into their roosts. He moved toward the sound with practiced silence, his moccasins making no noise on the carpet of pine needles and soft earth. His breathing remained controlled and shallow, his senses alert to every shift in the air, every movement in the shadows that grew longer with each passing moment. The light was fading fast now, that brief window between day and night when the world seemed to hold its breath. He pushed through a thicket of willows, their branches catching at his buckskin shirt, and emerged at the river's edge where the water pooled in a quiet eddy before continuing its journey south. And there, half submerged in the shallows, he found her. She lay twisted at an angle that spoke of complete exhaustion and surrender, her body having finally given up the fight to keep moving. Her dress had once been fine, the kind worn by women in the saloons of the white man's towns, all red silk and black lace meant to catch eyes and separate miners from their gold. But now it clung to her in tatters, the fabric torn and stained with mud and blood, the bright color dulled to something dark and ugly. Her feet were bare and bleeding, cut by rocks and thorns and the 100 sharp things that waited for unprotected flesh in the wilderness. Her dark blonde hair had come loose from whatever pins had once held it, and now floated around her face like river weed, tangled with bits of leaf and twig. She was young, maybe 24 or 25, and even in her current state, he could see she'd been beautiful before fear and flight had carved themselves into her features like scars. Blood had dried in streaks down her legs where the dress had torn, and her hands were scraped raw, the palms torn and dirty as if she'd crawled part of the way through the forest before reaching the river. One of her wrists bent at a strange angle that suggested it might be sprained or broken, and bruises in the shape of fingers marked her upper arms where someone had grabbed her hard enough to leave their impression. A cut above her left eyebrow had bled freely and then dried, leaving a dark trail down her temple and into her hairline. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration, and her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that spoke of shock setting in. Whatever had happened to her, whatever had driven her to run until she couldn't run anymore, it had been bad enough to make death in the wilderness seem preferable to going back. Lokni approached carefully, aware that white women had been known to scream at the sight of him, to assume the worst before he could speak or show that he meant no harm. The stories traveled through the settlements like wildfire, tales of savage Indians who stole women and children, who committed atrocities that existed more in imagination than reality. He'd learned to move slowly around white people, to keep his hands visible, to speak softly and avoid sudden movements that might be misinterpreted. But this one didn't scream when his shadow fell across her. Her eyes fluttered open, blue as the deepest part of the river, glazed with pain and something deeper than physical hurt, something that looked like the death of hope. Her lips moved, forming words that came out barely louder than the river's whisper, each syllable an obvious struggle. "I can't go on. I'm lost, please." The last word broke on a sob that she didn't have the strength to finish, her voice cracking like dry wood. Her hand reached toward him, trembling violently, the fingers pale and wrinkled from the cold water, and then fell back into the shallows with a small splash that sent ripples across the surface. Her chest rose and fell with rapid, shallow breaths that suggested her body was shutting down, preparing for the end. He'd seen animals die this way, giving up when the pain became too much, when continuing required more strength than they had. Left, he knelt beside her, his movements deliberate and slow, giving her time to see that he meant no harm, that his hands carried no weapons, that his face held no cruelty. Up close he could see more details that painted a picture of violence and terror. The bruises on her arms were fresh, probably less than a day old, dark purple, and angry against her pale skin. There were scratches on her neck that looked like they came from fingernails, and her dress was torn not just from running through the forest but from being grabbed, pulled, fought against. She'd been in a struggle before she ran, and she'd run far and fast with fear driving her forward long after her body wanted to stop. He could smell whiskey on the fabric of her dress, stale tobacco smoke, and something else, something sharp and bitter that might have been fear itself. He spoke to her in English, his voice low and steady, the accent marking him as someone who'd learned the language later in life, but had learned it well through necessity and survival. "You are hurt. I will help you. Do not be afraid." The words felt inadequate, too simple for the situation, but they were all he had. She stared at him, trying to focus through the haze of pain and exhaustion, trying to understand if he was real, or just another hallucination brought on by dehydration and desperation. Her eyes searched his face, looking for something, maybe kindness or maybe just confirmation that he wouldn't hurt her worse than she'd already been hurt. Her hand lifted slightly from the water again, trembling, and this time managed to grasp weakly at his arm before falling back. The touch was cold, so cold it startled him, and he realized she'd been in the water too long, that hypothermia was setting in despite the relatively mild evening temperature. She was beyond walking, perhaps beyond even sitting upright without help. Her body had given everything it had and now operated on fumes and desperation. He made his decision in that moment, knowing it would complicate his life in ways he couldn't fully predict, knowing it might bring danger to his door, but unable to simply walk away and let her die. Lokni moved with practiced efficiency born from years of hunting and surviving alone in country that didn't forgive mistakes. He gathered her into his arms with care not to worsen any injuries she might have, lifting her from the water with a strength that came from paddling rivers and hauling game and living a life that demanded physical capability. She was lighter than he expected, as if fear had burned away everything except the essential core of her, leaving her hollow and fragile. She made a small sound of protest or pain, he couldn't tell which, a whimper that escaped her cracked lips before she could stop it. But she didn't fight him, didn't try to pull away, as if some part of her understood that this was help, not harm. Her head lolled against his shoulder as he carried her toward the bullboat, her breathing warm against his neck, each exhale ragged and shallow. The sun was sinking faster now, the light going gold, and then orange, and then that deep red that meant night would follow soon. He needed to move, needed to get her somewhere warm and dry before the cold truly set in and finished what her pursuers had started. The bullboat sat waiting where the current was gentle, tied to a willow root with a length of braided sinew that had served him well for 2 seasons. He laid her carefully inside the circular craft, arranging her so she wouldn't roll as the boat moved with the current, positioning her in the center where the ride would be smoothest. She curled instinctively into herself when he set her down, drawing her knees up toward her chest in a protective position that spoke of deep trauma, of having learned through hard experience to make herself small. Her body shook with violent shivers despite the lingering warmth of the day, her teeth chattering in a rhythm that echoed the river's movement. He removed his buckskin shirt without hesitation, the evening air cool against his bare chest and arms, and covered her with it. The shirt was worn soft from use, decorated with beadwork his mother had done before the war, before everything changed. He tucked it around her carefully, trying to trap what little warmth remained in her body. He pushed the bullboat into deeper water, feeling the river take hold of it with familiar insistence, and climbed in behind her with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent most of his life on water. The craft settled under their combined weight but held steady, responding to his paddle with the easy familiarity of a well-trained horse. He positioned himself so he could paddle and watch her at the same time, so he could reach her quickly if she started to roll or if her condition worsened. The river carried them downstream, the current doing most of the work while Lokni steered around rocks and deadfalls, around the places where the water grew angry and white. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness as they traveled, sometimes making small sounds of distress that cut through the evening quiet, sometimes lying so still he had to watch the rise and fall of her chest to confirm she was still breathing. He spoke to her occasionally, meaningless words meant only to reassure, to remind her she wasn't alone anymore, that someone had found her and was taking her somewhere safe. The words were in English and Modoc both, a mixture that reflected his split existence between 2 worlds that wanted nothing to do with each other. She didn't respond, but sometimes her shivering would slow slightly, as if his voice alone provided some small comfort. The sky above them turned from gold to pink to deep purple as the stars began to emerge one by one. Ancient lights that had watched over this river long before any human ever set foot on its banks. The first stars of evening appeared in the east, bright and steady, while the western horizon still held the last glow of sunset. The air grew cooler as darkness settled, bringing with it the sounds of night creatures beginning their hunts and songs. Somewhere in the forest an owl called, its voice carrying across the water with eerie clarity. Frogs began their chorus from the shallows, and fish jumped occasionally, their splashes marking the river's surface with expanding rings. His cabin lay another 5 miles downstream, tucked into a bend where the river widened and slowed, where the forest grew thick enough to provide cover from prying eyes. He'd built it there deliberately 3 years ago, away from the main trails, away from the places where soldiers and settlers passed through with their suspicions and their guns. It was a place of solitude, chosen after he'd decided that living among his people had become too dangerous, that the reservation meant slow death through disease and despair, and he preferred to take his chances alone. The cabin represented survival, but it also represented a kind of exile he'd made peace with. A separation from community that hurt, but hurt less than watching his people fade away. As they traveled through the deepening night, his mind worked through what would come next. She would need care, days of it maybe, before she'd be strong enough to even stand unassisted. He had supplies, herbs his grandmother had taught him to use before she passed, knowledge of healing that bridged the gap between traditional medicine and the practical necessities of survival. He knew which plants stopped infection, which ones reduced fever, which ones helped with pain. But having her there would change everything about his carefully constructed isolation. Someone would come looking eventually, he was sure of that. White women didn't just disappear without consequences, without posses forming and questions being asked. The moon rose full and bright over the eastern mountains, turning the river into a ribbon of silver that seemed to flow with liquid light. By its illumination he could see her face more clearly now, the features that pain and fear had twisted becoming visible in their natural state as exhaustion dragged her deeper into unconscious rest. Even marked by injury and trauma, there was something striking about her, a quality he couldn't quite name. Strength maybe, hidden under layers of fear and pain, the kind that had kept her running long after most people would have given up. Or perhaps just the stubbornness required to survive in a world that seemed determined to break anyone who didn't fit its narrow definitions. He wondered what her story was. What series of events had led her to be running through wilderness in a saloon dress, with no shoes and terror in her eyes? Had she run from a man, from a debt, from violence or threat of worse? The bruises suggested violence, the torn dress suggested struggle, but the full picture remained hidden. In the morning, if she survived the night, maybe she would tell him. Or maybe she would keep her secrets. And he would respect that because he understood that some stories were too painful to speak aloud. The bullboat rounded a familiar bend and his cabin came into view, a dark shape against the darker forest. Relief settled over him. He guided the craft to shore, feeling the bottom scrape against river stones. He secured the boat quickly, then turned to the woman who hadn't moved for the last mile. He lifted her again, and for a moment feared she'd died during the journey. But her chest still rose and fell, and when he pressed fingers to her neck, he felt a pulse, weak but steady. She stirred slightly, her eyes opening briefly. "Where?" she whispered. "Safe," he told her. "You are safe now." The cabin was small but well made, its walls chinked against the wind, its roof solid overhead. He'd built it with his own hands using skills passed down through generations. Inside it was sparse but clean, a stone fireplace at one end, a sleeping platform built into the wall, shelves holding dried fish and herbs. He laid her on the platform, covering her with furs and blankets until she stopped shivering. He built up the fire from embers he'd banked that morning. Light and warmth filled the space. He heated water in a clay pot, adding herbs for pain and infection. Willow bark, yarrow sage. When it cooled enough, he lifted her head and helped her drink. She drank greedily at first, then slower, her eyes never leaving his face. After she'd drunk, he examined her injuries in the firelight. The cuts on her feet were numerous but shallow. The bruises were concerning but not dangerous. The cut above her eyebrow would scar, but nothing worse. What worried him was the exhaustion, the way her body had completely surrendered. He cleaned her wounds with warm water and soft cloth, his touch gentle. She flinched sometimes but didn't pull away. When he wrapped her feet in soft leather, she smiled, a small expression that vanished quickly. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, unable to speak. Outside the wind moved through the pines. The river continued past his door. A nightbird called. Lokni watched as she surrendered to real sleep, her breathing deepening, her face relaxing. He wondered who she was, what her name was, what had chased her here. He thought about morning, about the questions and complications daylight would bring. But for now there was only this moment. A stranger found. A life saved. Two people brought together by chance in a world determined to keep them apart. He added another log to the fire and settled against the wall, his knife within reach, his eyes on the door. Whatever came next, they would face it. For tonight, survival was enough. Morning light crept through the cracks in the cabin walls like cautious fingers, painting thin golden lines across the rough wooden floor. Lokni woke to the sound of the river and something else, a soft whimpering that pulled him instantly alert. The woman on the sleeping platform had thrown off one of the blankets in her sleep and was shivering again, her body curled tight, her face twisted in the grip of some nightmare he couldn't see. He rose quietly, added wood to the fire that had burned low during the night, and watched as the flames grew and pushed warmth back into the small space. She didn't wake, but her breathing eased slightly as the temperature rose. He studied her in the growing light, seeing details he'd missed in the darkness and firelight of the previous evening. Her face was younger than he'd first thought, the lines of fear and pain having aged her temporarily. There was a delicate quality to her features that spoke of a life that hadn't always been hard. That suggested she'd known better days before. Whatever circumstances had led her to a saloon and then to flight through the wilderness. Her hands, despite their current state of injury, showed no calluses from hard labor. She'd been something else before she'd been whatever she was now. He stepped outside into the cool morning air, letting the door close softly behind him. The forest was alive with bird songs, the territorial declarations and mating calls that marked the beginning of each day. The river ran silver and gold in the early light, its surface broken here and there by rising fish taking insects. It was the kind of morning that made a man grateful to be alive, that reminded him why he'd chosen this solitary existence despite its hardships. He walked to the river's edge and splashed cold water on his face, the shock of it clearing away the last fog of a restless night. When he returned to the cabin with fresh water from the river, she was awake. Her blue eyes followed him as he entered, wide and alert, the fear in them barely contained. She'd pushed herself up to a sitting position despite what it obviously cost her, her back against the wall, one of the blankets clutched to her chest like armor. Her other hand had found a piece of firewood, holding it like a club with white-knuckled desperation. She looked like a cornered animal, ready to fight despite having no real strength left to do so. Lokni stopped just inside the door, making himself still and small, keeping his movements slow and predictable. He set the water bucket down gently and raised his empty hands where she could see them. The gesture was universal, the language of peace that transcended words. He spoke quietly in English, his tone as calm as he could make it. "You are safe here. I will not hurt you. You were sick last night. You needed help." She stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her mind clearly trying to piece together how she'd gotten here. What had happened, whether she could trust anything he said. Her grip on the firewood didn't loosen, but something in her posture shifted slightly, the rigid tension easing by the smallest degree. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice hoarse and broken, each word scraping past her damaged throat. "My cabin," he answered simply. "By the Klamath River. You were in the water yesterday when sun was setting. You could not walk. I brought you here." He gestured toward the bucket. "I have water, food, medicine for your feet." She looked at the bucket, then back at him, then down at her bandaged feet as if seeing them for the first time. Memory seemed to flood back into her face, bringing with it a wave of emotions that played across her features like clouds racing across the sky. Fear, relief, confusion, and something darker that might have been shame or despair. The firewood slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. She covered her face with both hands, her shoulders beginning to shake. He thought she might be crying, But when she lowered her hands, her eyes were dry, as if she'd gone beyond tears to some place where they no longer served any purpose. "My name is Alice," she said finally, the words coming out flat and tired. "Alice Pritchard. Thank you for not leaving me to die." He nodded, acknowledging both the name and the gratitude. "I am Lokni," he replied. "It means rain cloud in my language." He moved slowly to the fire, giving her space, keeping his movements predictable. He ladled water into a clay cup and set it within her reach on the floor, not approaching close enough to threaten. She watched him with those sharp blue eyes, calculating, trying to decide if this was real safety or just a different kind of danger. After a long moment, she reached for the cup, wincing as the movement pulled at injuries and stiff muscles. She drank carefully, testing her stomach's willingness to accept the water. When it stayed down, she drank more, finishing the cup and setting it aside. "How long was I asleep?" she asked. "One night," he answered. "The sun is new today." She nodded slowly, looking around the cabin as if cataloging everything. Planning escape routes, perhaps, or just trying to orient herself in this strange new reality she'd woken into. The cabin was sparse enough that the inventory didn't take long. One room, one door, one small window covered with oiled hide that let in light but kept out wind. The fireplace with its carefully stacked wood. The shelves with their dried fish and herbs and simple tools. His bow and quiver hanging on the wall, his rifle leaning in the corner. The sleeping platform where she sat. A small table and one chair. The absence of anything decorative or unnecessary. It was the home of someone who'd stripped life down to its essentials, who'd learned to need very little. "I need to tell you what happened," Alice said suddenly. The words coming out in a rush as if she'd been holding them back and they'd finally broken free. "So you know what might be coming. So you can decide if you want me to leave." Lokni turned from the fire where he'd been stirring a pot of corn mash, giving her his full attention. She took a breath, steadying herself, and began to speak. She'd been working at the Silver Star Saloon in Eureka, she said, a town 2 days' ride to the south. She'd ended up there through a series of bad choices and worse luck, the kind of story he'd heard variations of before. A husband who died in a mine collapse, debts she couldn't pay, limited options for a woman alone. The saloon owner, a man named Garrett Webb, had offered her work serving drinks and singing for the miners. It had seemed better than the alternatives at the time. For 6 months it had been tolerable, she continued, her voice gaining strength as the story unfolded. Webb had kept the worst of the men away from her, had maintained some semblance of order in his establishment. But then things changed. He started looking at her differently, started making comments and suggestions that made her skin crawl. When she rebuffed his advances, he became angry. The protection he'd offered disappeared. The men grew bolder. Her wages, never much to begin with, started disappearing into fines and fees for imagined infractions. 3 nights ago, she said, her voice dropping lower, Webb had come to her room after the saloon closed. He'd been drinking, his breath thick with whiskey and rage. He'd told her she owed him, that she'd been eating his food and sleeping under his roof, and it was time to pay what she owed. When she'd refused, when she'd fought back, he'd hit her. The bruises on her arms, the scratches on her neck, those were from him. She'd managed to get away, had run into the night wearing nothing but her saloon dress and shoes she'd lost somewhere in the darkness. She'd run north, away from the town, away from the main roads where Webb's men might find her. She'd run through forest and over rocks, terror driving her forward even when her feet bled and her lungs burned. She'd run until she couldn't run anymore, until she'd collapsed in the river where Lokni had found her. And now Webb would be looking for her, she finished, her voice hollow. He won't let me go. He'll say I stole from him or make up some other story. He has friends, men who owe him favors. They'll come looking. Lokni listened to all of this without interruption, his face calm but his mind working through the implications. He'd known taking her in would bring complications, but hearing the details made those complications concrete and immediate. A white man with money and connections looking for a woman he considered his property.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
That was dangerous in ways that went beyond simple pursuit. That was the kind of situation that could bring a dozen armed men to his door. That could end with blood and fire. But looking at Alice, at the fear and defiance mixed together in her expression, at the way she held herself ready for him to tell her to leave, he knew he wouldn't send her away. Some decisions weren't really decisions at all. Some things you did because they were right, even when they were dangerous. He met her eyes directly, his voice firm and clear. "You will stay here until you are strong. Then we will decide what comes next. If men come looking, we will handle that when it happens. You are under my protection now." Something shifted in her face, a tension releasing that he hadn't fully noticed until it was gone. Tears did come then, silent and steady, tracking down her cheeks though she made no sound. "Why would you do this?" she asked quietly. "You don't know me. Helping me could get you killed." He considered the question, reaching for words to explain something he didn't fully understand himself. "My grandmother used to say that the world has too much cruelty already," he said finally. "She said that when we have a choice to add kindness instead, we should take it. You needed help. I could give it. That is enough reason." Alice wiped at her tears with the back of her hand, wincing as the movement pulled at her injuries. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Thank you seems too small." "You say nothing," he replied. "You rest and heal. That is thanks enough." He turned back to the pot over the fire, ladling the corn mash into a wooden bowl. "When you are strong enough to eat, this will help. It is simple, but it will give you strength." She accepted the bowl when he brought it to her, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. The touch was innocent but electric somehow. Two people who were strangers recognizing something in each other that went beyond circumstance. She ate slowly, testing each bite, her stomach clearly unsure about accepting food after so long without. He watched from across the room, making sure she could keep it down. Ready to help if needed, but respecting her space. Between bites, she asked him questions, her curiosity apparently stronger than her exhaustion. How long had he lived here? 3 years, he told her. Why alone? Because my people are gone or scattered, and the white man's world has no place for me, he answered honestly. Wasn't he lonely? Sometimes, he admitted, but loneliness was safer than the alternatives. She nodded as if she understood, and perhaps she did. Perhaps they were both refugees in their own ways. Both people who'd learned that sometimes survival meant isolation. When she'd eaten as much as she could, which wasn't much. He took the bowl away and brought her fresh water to wash her face and hands. She cleaned herself carefully, the simple act of washing away some of the dirt and blood seeming to restore a measure of her dignity. He changed the bandages on her feet, noting with satisfaction that the wounds looked clean, no signs of infection yet. The herbs were working. She would heal, given time. The morning passed quietly, marked by small domestic tasks and cautious conversation. He showed her where things were in the cabin, explained his routines, made sure she understood she was welcome to anything she needed. She watched him move through his space, seeing how he worked, how he kept everything orderly and purposeful. There was a grace to his movements despite his size. An economy of motion that came from living deliberately. By midday her exhaustion caught up with her again, and she dozed, her body demanding rest to fuel the healing process. Lokni took the opportunity to go outside and check his surroundings, looking for any signs of pursuit or danger. The forest was quiet, showing no evidence of horses or men. The trails remained empty. For now, they were safe. But he knew that could change quickly. He spent the afternoon repairing a fish trap that had been damaged in the spring floods, his hands working automatically while his mind turned over the problem of Alice Pritchard and what came next. She couldn't stay here forever. Eventually she would need to decide where to go, how to build a new life somewhere Webb couldn't find her. But she needed time first, time to heal and regain her strength, time to think clearly without fear clouding every decision. When he returned to the cabin as the sun began its descent, he found her awake again, sitting up and looking stronger than she had that morning. She'd managed to braid her hair loosely, pulling it back from her face, and the simple act of grooming seemed to have lifted her spirits slightly. She'd also found his spare shirt, oversized on her but cleaner and more practical than the torn saloon dress she'd arrived in. The red silk lay folded on the edge of the platform, a reminder of what she'd left behind. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing to the shirt. "My dress was ruined." "You are welcome to anything here," he assured her. "That shirt serves better on you than sitting on a shelf." She smiled, a real smile this time, small but genuine. It transformed her face, showing him what she must have looked like before fear and hardship had made their marks. Beautiful, yes, but more than that. Alive in a way that suffering tried to steal. That evening he cooked fish he'd caught earlier in the week, preparing it with herbs and wild onions, creating a meal that was simple but nourishing. They ate together in companionable silence, the awkwardness of strangers beginning to ease into something more comfortable. After dinner, she insisted on helping clean up despite his protests, needing perhaps to feel useful rather than helpless. He let her wash the wooden bowls and cups while he tended the fire, both of them moving carefully around each other in the small space, as darkness fell and the fire burned low. Casting dancing shadows on the walls, Alice spoke again. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I know I can't stay here forever," she said, "but I don't know where to go. Webb has connections throughout the territory. If I go to another town, he'll find me eventually." Lokni considered this, staring into the flames. "There are places," he said slowly. "Remote places where questions aren't asked. Mining camps in the mountains. Settlements on the coast. Even among my people, some who've left the reservation." She would need a new name, a new story. "But it could be done," she nodded, absorbing this. "How long before I can travel?" she asked. "Your feet need at least a week to heal enough for walking," he answered. "Maybe 2. We have time to plan." She was quiet for a long moment, then spoke again, her voice thick with emotion. "Why are you helping me like this, Lokni? You could have just pointed me toward a town, given me water and sent me on my way. Why risk bringing trouble to your door?" He turned to look at her directly, his dark eyes meeting her blue ones across the fire's glow. "Because when I found you in that river," he said quietly, "I saw someone who had run as far as they could go. Someone who had nothing left but the hope that the world might show mercy. How could I see that and turn away? How could I live with myself if I left you there to die?" She held his gaze, something unspoken passing between them, an understanding that went deeper than words. Outside the wind picked up, rustling through the pines with a sound like distant voices. The river continued its eternal song, unchanging and indifferent to human drama. Somewhere in the darkness an animal called, its cry lonely and wild. Inside the cabin, warmth and firelight created a pocket of safety in a dangerous world. 2 wounded people, brought together by chance, beginning to recognize in each other the possibility of something neither had dared hope for. Not love, not yet, but perhaps the foundation on which trust might be built. Alice settled back against the wall, pulling the blankets around herself. "Thank you," she said one more time, and this time the words carried weight beyond simple gratitude. "Thank you for seeing me as worth saving." Lokni nodded, adding another log to the fire. "Sleep now," he said gently. "Tomorrow we begin the work of healing. One day at a time." She closed her eyes, her breathing evening out as exhaustion claimed her once more. He settled himself in his usual spot against the opposite wall, his rifle within reach, his knife on his belt. The night deepened around them, stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns. Inside the cabin, two people slept with the cautious peace of those who know danger still lurks, but have chosen to rest anyway. The fire burned steady through the darkness, a small defiant light against the vast unknown. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own choices. But for tonight, there was shelter and warmth and the fragile beginning of trust. For tonight, that was miracle enough. 5 days had passed since Lokni pulled Alice from the river, and the rhythm of the cabin had shifted to accommodate 2 lives instead of 1. The morning of the 6th day broke clear and cold, frost painting delicate patterns on the window hide and turning the world outside into something crystalline and fragile. Alice woke before dawn, something she'd been doing more frequently as her strength returned, and lay quietly listening to Lokni's steady breathing from across the room. She'd grown accustomed to his presence, to the sound of him moving through the small space with that careful grace that spoke of a life lived in harmony with resources. Her feet had healed remarkably well under his care, the cuts closing clean and the swelling reduced to almost nothing. She could walk now without wincing at every step, though he'd cautioned her against pushing too hard too fast. The bruises on her arms had faded from purple to yellow-green, and the cut above her eyebrow had formed a thin scab that would likely leave only the faintest scar. Physically she was mending. Emotionally the healing moved slower, marked by nightmares that sometimes woke her gasping and moments of panic when unexpected sounds made her heart race. She rose carefully, not wanting to wake him, and added wood to the fire from the stack he kept beside the hearth. The flames caught and grew, pushing back the pre-dawn chill. She'd learned his routines over the past days, had begun to anticipate what needed doing and when. It gave her something to focus on beyond her fear, something to occupy her hands and mind. She put water on to heat, preparing the bitter tea he drank each morning, made from herbs he gathered and dried himself. Lokni stirred as the water began to steam, his eyes opening immediately to full alertness without the fog of sleep that affected most people. It was a hunter's awareness, she'd learned, the ability to wake completely and instantly when needed. He sat up, nodding his thanks when she handed him a cup of the tea. The gesture was small but significant, a shift from patient to partner in the daily work of survival. They drank in comfortable silence as the dawnlight strengthened, painting the cabin's interior in shades of gold and amber. "Today, I want to show you something," he said after they'd finished their tea and eaten a breakfast of dried fish and flatbread he'd made the previous evening. "If you feel strong enough for a short walk." Alice felt a flutter of excitement mixed with nervousness. She'd been confined to the cabin and its immediate surroundings since her arrival, venturing no farther than the river's edge. The thought of seeing more of this territory both thrilled and frightened her. What if someone saw them? What if Webb's men were out there searching? As if reading her thoughts, Lokni spoke again. "We will stay away from trails. No one comes to where we are going. It is a place I have kept secret." She studied his face, seeing something there she hadn't noticed before, a desire to share something meaningful with her. It touched her in a way that surprised her with its intensity. She nodded. "I'd like that very much." They prepared for the journey carefully, Lokni packing water and food in a leather bag, Alice wearing a pair of his moccasins that he'd modified to fit her smaller feet. He gave her a doeskin jacket to ward off the morning chill, and she wrapped herself in it gratefully, breathing in the smell of smoke and pine and something distinctly him. He took his rifle and knife, precautions against both human and animal threats, and led her out of the cabin into the bright morning. The forest was alive with autumn color, the aspens turned gold and the oaks deep red, their leaves creating a canopy of fire above them. The air smelled of wood smoke and falling leaves and the rich loam of earth preparing for winter. Birds called from the branches, and somewhere in the distance, a raven's harsh cry echoed through the trees. Alice followed Loki along a path only he could see, watching how he moved through the undergrowth without disturbing it. Leaving almost no trace of his passage, they walked for perhaps an hour, moving steadily upward along the slope of a ridge. Alice's legs protested the exertion after days of rest, but she pushed through it, determined to prove she could keep up. Loki checked on her frequently without making it obvious, adjusting their pace when he noticed her breathing grow labored. Finally they crested the ridge and he stopped, gesturing ahead with quiet pride. Before them lay a hidden valley, small and perfect, cradled between two arms of the mountain. A stream ran through its center, feeding a pool so clear Alice could see the stones at its bottom from where she stood. The valley was thick with old growth trees, their trunks massive and ancient, and the morning light filtered through their branches in shafts of golden brilliance. Wildflowers still bloomed, despite the lateness of the season, protected by the valley's sheltered position. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. "This is my place," Loki said quietly. "I found it 2 years ago. No trails lead here. No one knows it but me. And now you." Alice understood the significance of what he was sharing, the trust implicit in bringing her to this secret sanctuary. She moved forward slowly, taking it all in, feeling something loosen in her chest that had been tight since the night she'd fled Eureka. Here, in this hidden place, the world's cruelty seemed very far away. They spent the morning exploring the valley, Loki showing her the different plants that grew there, teaching her which ones could be eaten and which had medicinal properties. He showed her where deer came to drink, pointing out their tracks in the soft earth near the pool. He showed her the tree where an owl nested, and the hollow log where a fox had made its den. With each revelation, Alice felt herself relaxing further, allowing herself to simply be present in the moment, rather than constantly bracing for disaster. They ate their midday meal beside the pool, sitting on sun-warmed rocks and watching the water flow past. Alice found herself talking more freely than she had since arriving at his cabin, telling him about her life before everything went wrong. She'd grown up in Ohio, she said, in a town where everyone knew everyone and life moved at a pace measured by seasons and church bells. She'd married young, too young probably. But Daniel Pritchard had seemed like stability and future and everything a young woman was supposed to want. He'd been a good man, she continued, her voice softening with memory. Kind and gentle, maybe too gentle for the harsh realities of frontier life. They'd come west chasing the promise of gold and opportunity, like so many others. He'd found work in the mines near Eureka, swearing it would just be until they saved enough to buy land and start a farm. But the mine had taken him, a collapse that killed 7 men, including her husband. She'd been left alone with his debts and no way to pay them. The rest, Loki knew. The saloon web, the desperate flight into the wilderness. But hearing it all together, understanding the full arc of how she'd arrived at his door, gave him a deeper appreciation for her resilience. She'd survived losses that would have broken many people, had kept fighting even when the odds were stacked impossibly against her. There was steel in her beneath the fear, strength she perhaps didn't fully recognize in herself. "What about you?" Alice asked, turning the conversation away from her own painful history. "You've told me very little about yourself. What brought you to live alone in these mountains?" Loki was quiet for a long moment, watching the water flow past. It was a fair question, and one he found he wanted to answer, though talking about the past always carried its own pain. "I was born in a village near Lower Klamath Lake," he began slowly. "My people had lived there for more generations than anyone could count. We fished and hunted, lived according to the old ways and the turning of seasons. It was a good life. But then the white settlers came, wanting the land for ranches and farms. They said we were in the way, that we had to move to the reservation, His voice remained steady as he continued, but Alice could hear the emotion beneath it. Some of our leaders tried to resist. They said the reservation land was poor, that moving there meant slow death for our people. The government sent soldiers. There was fighting. His jaw tightened. My father was killed in the first battles. My mother died of sickness on the reservation, the kind that comes from despair as much as disease. My younger sister, she tried to run away and was caught and sent back. I do not know if she still lives. Alice reached out without thinking, placing her hand over his where it rested on the rock between them. The gesture surprised them both, but neither pulled away. I stayed on the reservation for 2 years, Lokni continued. Watching my people lose themselves, watching the old ways die. Finally, I could not bear it anymore. I left in the night, came to these mountains. I knew if they caught me, they would send me back or worse. But living as a hunted man seemed better than dying slowly in that place. They sat in silence for a while, hands still touching, each absorbing the weight of the other's story. Two people from different worlds, brought together by violence and chance, finding unexpected understanding in a hidden valley far from the places that had wounded them. The sun moved across the sky, warming the rocks beneath them, and the stream continued its endless song. Eventually Lokni spoke again, his tone lighter. I should teach you to fish, he said. The pool here is full of trout. If you are going to survive in wild places, you need to know how to feed yourself. Alice smiled, grateful for the shift away from painful memories. I'd like that. Though I should warn you, I have no experience beyond watching my father fish in Ohio when I was a girl. He showed her how to read the water, where the fish liked to hold in the current. How to move slowly so as not to spook them. He'd brought a length of line and a hook made from bone, and he demonstrated how to bait it with insects found under rocks near the shore. Alice watched intently, asking questions, her natural intelligence evident in how quickly she grasped the concepts. When he handed her the line, she took it with determination. Her first several attempts resulted in nothing but tangled line and lost bait. But she persisted with a stubbornness he was coming to recognize as fundamental to her character. Finally, on her 7th try, she felt the line pull tight and let out a surprised laugh. I think I've got one. Help me, I don't want to lose it. He guided her through landing the fish, a beautiful trout that flashed silver in the sunlight as she pulled it from the water. Her face when she held it up was radiant with accomplishment. They caught 3 more fish between them before the afternoon began to wane, enough for several meals. As they prepared to leave the valley, Alice turned back for one last look, committing it to memory. Thank you for bringing me here, she said softly. For trusting me with your secret place. Lokni shouldered the bag with their catch and smiled, a rare full smile that transformed his usually serious face. It is no longer just my place, he said. Now it is ours. The walk back to the cabin felt shorter somehow, their conversation flowing easily as they moved through the forest. Alice found herself laughing at one of Lokni's dry observations about a territorial squirrel they passed, and the sound surprised her. When had she last laughed? Not in months, certainly. Perhaps not since before Daniel died. The realization was both sad and liberating. They arrived back at the cabin as the sun touched the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Lokni built up the fire while Alice cleaned the fish they'd caught, using the knife he'd given her and the techniques he'd demonstrated. They worked together preparing the evening meal with an ease that spoke of growing familiarity, moving around each other in the small space without awkwardness. As they ate, Alice found herself studying Lokni's face in the firelight, really looking at him perhaps for the first time without the haze of pain and fear that had colored her first days here. He had strong features, high cheekbones, and a straight nose, dark eyes that held both sadness and strength. His hair, black and straight, hung past his shoulders, and he wore it loose except when working. There was a dignity to him, a quiet self-possession that she found deeply attractive. The thought startled her. She hadn't allowed herself to think of any man in those terms since Daniel's death, had believed that part of her life was finished. But sitting here across the fire from Lokni, watching his capable hands and hearing his rare laugh, she felt something awakening that she'd thought was gone forever. It frightened her even as it drew her forward. Lokni seemed to sense the shift in her mood, glancing up to meet her eyes. His expression was questioning but not intrusive, giving her space to speak or remain silent as she chose. Alice looked down at her hands, gathering courage. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly. He nodded. "When you look at me, what do you see? Do you see someone broken? Someone damaged beyond repair?" He set down the piece of fish he'd been eating and gave her question the consideration it deserved. "I see someone who survived," he said finally. "Someone who ran until she couldn't run anymore, and then found the strength to keep living. I see someone who learns quickly, who doesn't give up even when things are hard. I see someone who laughs at stubborn squirrels and catches fish and shares stories by firelight." He paused. "I see Alice, not what was done to her, but who she is." The words settled over her like a benediction, releasing something she'd been holding tight inside. Tears came then, not the silent tears of grief, but something cleaner, almost joyful. No one had seen her, truly seen her in so long. In Erika she'd been invisible or worse, an object to be used. But Lokni saw her as a person, whole and worthy. The gift of that recognition was almost overwhelming. She wiped at her tears, embarrassed by their intensity. "I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm crying." "You are healing," he said simply. "Sometimes healing hurts before it feels better." She nodded, understanding the truth in his words. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, the fire crackling softly between them. Later, as they settled into their respective sleeping areas, Alice spoke into the darkness. "Lokni, yes, thank you for today. For the valley, for the fishing, for everything you said. For seeing me." His response came quietly but firmly. "You do not need to thank me for seeing what is there. Sleep now. Tomorrow we will practice more skills you need." But sleep was slow in coming for Alice that night. She lay in the darkness, listening to the river and the wind and Lokni's steady breathing, and felt something fundamental shifting inside her. She'd come to this cabin broken and terrified, seeing it as nothing more than temporary shelter before the next disaster. But somehow, in the space of less than a week, it had become something more. Not just shelter, but home. Not just survival, but the possibility of actually living again. The thought should have terrified her, given everything she'd lost and everything that still threatened. Webb was still out there. The danger hadn't passed. But lying here in the darkness, warm and fed and safe, she found she couldn't regret the strange path that had led her to Lokni's door. Whatever came next, whatever challenges they would face, she knew with sudden certainty that she wasn't facing them alone anymore. And that made all the difference. Outside, an owl called from the pines, its voice carrying across the night. The river sang its endless song, and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance. Inside the cabin, two people rested in the fragile peace they'd built together, gathering strength for whatever tomorrow might bring. The fire burned low but steady, a small light against the darkness, refusing to go out. The third week of Alice's stay began with an unexpected cold snap that turned the morning air sharp as broken glass and left a thin skin of ice on the water bucket outside the cabin door. Lokni woke to find frost had crept through the cracks in the walls during the night, painting delicate patterns on the interior wood that would melt as soon as the fire grew strong. He rose quietly and built up the flames, then stood at the small window watching the forest emerge from darkness into the gray light of pre-dawn. Something felt different this morning, a tension in the air that made the hair on his neck prickle with warning. Alice stirred on the sleeping platform, emerging from the cocoon of furs and blankets with sleepy confusion. It's freezing, she mumbled, pulling one of the blankets around her shoulders as she moved closer to the fire. Winter is coming early this year, Lokni said, still watching the forest through the window. The animals know it. They have been preparing for weeks. We should do the same. There was something in his tone that made Alice fully awake.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
A gravity that suggested he meant more than simply gathering firewood. Over breakfast, he explained what had been growing in his mind for the past few days. She was strong enough now to travel if needed, her feet fully healed, and her overall condition much improved from the half-drowned woman he'd pulled from the river. But winter in these mountains was brutal, and his cabin, built for one person surviving alone, would be tested by the addition of another mouth to feed and body to keep warm. More than that, the question of her future could not be postponed forever. Webb would still be looking, and as winter closed the high passes and limited travel, the search would intensify in the areas that remained accessible. Alice listened with growing understanding and a sinking feeling in her stomach. "You're saying I need to leave," she said flatly, trying to keep the hurt from her voice and failing. Lokni turned from the window to face her directly. "I am saying we need to make a plan," he corrected gently. "You cannot hide here forever. Eventually you must build a new life somewhere. But where that is, and when you go, these are decisions we should make together. Not something forced by weather or discovery." She absorbed this, recognizing the truth in his words, even as every part of her resisted the idea of leaving this place that had become her sanctuary. "Where would I even go?" she asked, hearing the despair creeping into her voice. "Every town within 100 miles might have someone who knows Webb or owes him favors. I have no money, no references, no way to prove I'm anything other than what he'll claim I am. A thief. A whore who ran out on her debts." Lokni moved to sit across from her, his dark eyes serious but not unkind. "There are options," he said. "I have been thinking on this. There's a mission school on the coast, run by a priest who asks no questions about people's pasts. They take in women who need shelter, teach them skills. It is far enough from Eureka that Webb's reach might not extend there. Another option, there is a Modoc family, distant cousins of mine, who left the reservation and live near the Oregon border. They might take you in, let you work for your keep until you can establish yourself." Alice considered these possibilities, trying to imagine herself in either scenario. Both meant leaving Lokni, leaving this cabin that had become more home in 3 weeks than any place had been in years. The thought created an ache in her chest that surprised her with its intensity. "What if I don't want to go?" she said quietly. "What if I want to stay here? With you?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither had directly addressed until now. Lokni's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to read before settling into something carefully neutral. "Alice," he said slowly, "you know that is complicated. The world does not look kindly on a white woman living with an Indian man. If we were discovered, the consequences would fall harder on you than on me. They would say I kidnapped you, forced you. No one would believe you came willingly. I don't care what people would say." Alice interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "I'm tired of living my life based on what other people think or want. Daniel married me because it was expected. I went to work at the saloon because society left me no other acceptable option. I've been running from other people's judgments my entire life." She met his eyes directly. "Here, with you, I feel like I can finally breathe. Like I can be myself without apology. Doesn't that matter more than what some strangers might think?" "It matters," Lokni agreed quietly. "But it does not change the reality of the danger. Not just from Webb, but from anyone who might see us together and decide we are breaking their rules. I have lived as a hunted man for 3 years, Alice. I know how to survive alone, how to disappear when necessary. But with you here, everything becomes more visible, more vulnerable. I could not bear it if my presence in your life brought you more harm. Then teach me, Alice said with sudden fierce determination. Teach me to survive the way you do. To hunt and track and read the forest. To be invisible when necessary. You said yourself I learn quickly. Her eyes blazed with an intensity that took him by surprise. I'm not asking you to save me, Lokni. I'm asking you to help me save myself. And then, if I choose to stay, it will be as an equal, not as a burden. Lokni studied her for a long moment, seeing the steel beneath the surface that he'd recognized from the beginning, but which now showed itself fully. She meant what she said. This wasn't desperation speaking, or gratitude mistaken for something deeper. This was a woman who had found something worth fighting for, and was prepared to do the work required. The realization shifted something in him, opening a possibility he hadn't allowed himself to fully consider. If I do this, he said carefully, it will not be easy. The skills you need take time to develop. You will be cold and tired and frustrated. There will be days when you want to give up. And at the end of it, you still might decide to leave, to find an easier path. I need to know you understand that. Alice nodded. I understand. But I also know that easy paths haven't served me well. Maybe it's time I tried the hard one. Very well, Lokni said, something like respect warming his voice. We start today. But first, there is something I must do. He rose and went to a corner of the cabin, where several items lay wrapped in oiled cloth. He returned carrying a bundle which he unwrapped carefully, revealing a beautiful knife in a beaded sheath. The blade was sharp and well-maintained, the handle wrapped in leather. The sheath decorated with intricate geometric patterns in blue and white beads. This was my mother's knife, he said, holding it with obvious reverence. She carried it every day, used it for everything from preparing food to cutting medicine plants. When she died, it came to me. He extended it toward Alice, the gesture clearly significant. If you are going to learn to survive in wild places, you need tools of your own. I want you to have this. Not as a loan, but as a gift. So you will always have something to protect yourself with, something to work with. Alice took the knife with trembling hands, understanding the profound trust implicit in the offering. This belonged to your mother, she whispered. I can't take something so precious. You can, and you will, Lokni said firmly. My mother would have wanted it to go to someone who would use it, who would honor it by living fully. I think she would have liked you, Alice Pritchard. I think she would have seen in you the same strength I see. Tears pricked at Alice's eyes, but she blinked them back, running her fingers over the beadwork on the sheath. Thank you, she said, the words inadequate but sincere. I'll treasure it. I'll use it well. Good, Lokni said with a nod. Now come. We have work to do before the snow comes. And it will come soon, I can feel it in the air. They spent that day, and the ones that followed, in intensive training, that left Alice exhausted, but exhilarated. Lokni taught her to move through the forest quietly, to place her feet carefully and use the natural cover of terrain and vegetation. He showed her how to identify animal tracks and read their stories, how to find water sources and test them for safety, how to build a fire in wet conditions using materials that seemed impossibly damp. He taught her which plants could be eaten and which were poisonous, which had medicinal properties, and how to prepare them. Alice absorbed everything with fierce concentration, practicing until her muscles ached and her mind swam with information. She learned to set snares for rabbits and squirrels, to identify the signs that predators left to mark their territories, to predict weather changes by observing the behavior of birds and insects. Lokni was a patient but demanding teacher, correcting her mistakes without judgment, but insisting she repeat tasks until she could perform them correctly. In the evenings, after they'd eaten and cleaned up from dinner, he taught her other skills. How to tan hides properly so they remained supple. How to make cordage from plant fibers. how to repair tears in leather with sinew and a bone needle, how to maintain her knife so it stayed sharp and rust-free. Alice's hands, soft from her brief time in the saloon, began to develop calluses and strength. She found satisfaction in the work that went beyond mere survival, a pride in creating useful things with her own skill. As the days passed and her competence grew, so did the ease between them. They developed a rhythm of working together that felt natural and right, each anticipating what the other needed without words. Sometimes their hands would brush during a shared task, and the touch would linger a moment longer than necessary. Sometimes their eyes would meet across the fire and hold, conversations happening in silence that neither was quite ready to speak aloud. 2 weeks into Alice's training, the first real snow came. They woke to a world transformed, everything buried under 6 inches of white powder that made the familiar landscape strange and beautiful. The river ran dark against the whiteness, steaming slightly where the warmer water met the cold air. The trees stood laden with snow that bent their branches into new shapes. And the silence was profound, as if the world itself held its breath. "This is when the real test begins," Lokni said as they stood outside the cabin surveying the changed world. "In summer, the forest provides easily for those who know how to ask. In winter, it makes you work for everything. You must be smarter, more careful, more persistent. Many have died in these mountains because they did not respect winter's power." Alice nodded, understanding the seriousness of his tone. "Then teach me to respect it," she said. "Teach me to survive it." He took her tracking through the snow, showing her how the white canvas made animal movements visible in new ways. She learned to identify the bounding track of rabbits, the delicate prints of deer, the heavy tread of elk. She learned how predators used the snow to their advantage, and how prey animals adapted their behavior to survive. They checked the snares she'd set, finding 2 rabbits which they cleaned and prepared together. And Lokni praised her improving knife work. One afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after the first snow, they were returning to the cabin with a deer Lokni had shot when they both froze simultaneously. In the distance, barely audible over the sound of the wind through the pines, came the whinny of a horse. Then another sound, men's voices raised in conversation or argument. They were too far away for the words to be clear, but the direction was unmistakable. Someone was approaching from the south, from the direction of Eureka. Lokni and Alice exchanged a look of shared understanding and fear. This was what they'd been dreading, the moment when the outside world intruded on their sanctuary. Without speaking, they moved as one, Lokni shouldering the deer carcass and Alice gathering their tools. They moved swiftly but carefully through the snow, taking a longer route that kept them away from the approaching voices, circling wide to approach the cabin from an unexpected direction. Once inside, Lokni moved with practiced efficiency. He hid the deer in a cache beneath the floorboards he'd built for exactly this purpose, then began securing anything that would indicate a woman's presence. Alice's torn saloon dress, the spare clothes he'd modified for her, anything obviously feminine went into a chest that he shoved under the sleeping platform. Alice worked alongside him, her heart pounding but her hands steady. They'd prepared for this possibility, had discussed what to do if searchers came. When everything that could be hidden was hidden, Lokni turned to Alice with an expression that mixed determination and regret. "You need to go to the valley," he said quietly. "Take supplies for 2 days. If these are Webb's men, they will search here. You cannot be found." Alice felt ice settle in her stomach at the thought of being separated from him, of hiding alone in the forest while he faced whatever was coming. "What if they hurt you?" she asked. "What if they think you know something and try to force you to tell?" "I can handle myself," Lokni assured her, though his hand moved unconsciously to check his knife. "And I truly know nothing of value to tell them. A woman passed through days ago, asked for water, moved on toward the north. That is all I will say, and there is nothing here to contradict that story. But you cannot be here. If they find you, everything becomes more dangerous for both of us." He gripped her shoulders gently. "Trust me, Alice. Go to the valley. I will come for you when it is safe." She wanted to argue, wanted to insist on staying and facing whatever came together. But she recognized the wisdom in his plan and the necessity of following it. She nodded reluctantly, gathering the supplies he'd indicated, strapping on snowshoes he'd taught her to use, securing her mother's knife at her belt. At the door, she turned back to face him. "Be careful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Come back to me." He met her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I will," he promised. "Now go." Alice slipped out into the cold afternoon, moving swiftly through the snow toward the hidden valley that had become their secret place. Behind her, the cabin that had been home for nearly a month grew smaller with distance. She forced herself not to look back, focusing instead on the path ahead, on placing her feet carefully in the snowshoe's rhythm, on reaching safety before the searchers arrived. But her heart remained behind with Lokni. And with every step she prayed to whatever gods might listen that he would be safe, that this separation would be temporary, that the fragile peace they'd built wouldn't shatter under the weight of the outside world's intrusion. The voices grew louder behind her, echoing through the winter forest, harsh and demanding. She moved faster, her breath coming in white clouds, her face stinging from the cold wind. The valley was still 2 miles away, and darkness was coming. She had to reach it before full night fell, had to trust that Lokni could handle whatever was about to arrive at his door. The snow crunched beneath her snowshoes, and overhead the sky was darkening to that particular shade of gray that preceded a storm. Winter had truly arrived, bringing with it not just cold and snow, but danger in human form. Alice reached the hidden valley just as full darkness settled over the mountains, her lungs burning from the exertion and cold air, her legs trembling from the forced march through deepening snow. The valley looked different under its winter blanket, transformed from the sun-dappled sanctuary she remembered into something stark and almost otherworldly in the moonlight that filtered through the clouds. She made her way to the sheltered overhang near the pool where Lokni had once shown her how ancient people had carved symbols into the rock, a place protected from wind and the worst of the weather. Her hands shook as she built a small fire using the techniques he'd drilled into her over the past weeks. Striking sparks from flint and steel into a nest of dry tinder she'd carried in a pouch designed to keep it protected from moisture. The flame caught and grew, and she fed it carefully with small twigs before adding larger pieces of wood. The warmth was immediate and welcome, but it did nothing to ease the cold fear that had settled in her chest. Lokni was back there, alone, facing men who might be looking for her. Men who worked for Garrett Webb. She forced herself to eat some of the dried meat and flatbread she'd brought, knowing she needed to maintain her strength, even though her stomach churned with anxiety. Then she settled as close to the fire as she dared, wrapping herself in the furs and blankets she'd carried, and tried to quiet her racing thoughts. The night stretched ahead endlessly, each sound in the forest making her start and reach for the knife at her belt. Was that a branch breaking under footsteps or just snow sliding from an overburdened limb? Was that men's voices or simply the wind moving through the pines? Sleep came in fitful patches, nightmares blending with waking worry until she couldn't tell which was which. She dreamed of Webb's face, of his hands grabbing at her, and woke gasping to find herself alone by a dying fire. She dreamed of Lokni bleeding in the snow while she stood frozen and unable to help, and woke with tears freezing on her cheeks. The night seemed to last forever, but eventually the sky began to lighten toward dawn. Gray and heavy with the promise of more snow. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Lokni had watched Alice disappear into the forest with a tight feeling in his chest that he recognized as fear not for himself, but for her. Then he'd turned his attention to preparing for the visitors whose voices grew steadily louder as they approached. He moved through the cabin one final time, making sure nothing remained visible that would betray Alice's presence. Then he stepped outside, assuming a posture of casual unconcern, and waited. 3 men emerged from the trees on horseback, their mounts picking their way carefully through the snow. Lokni recognized the type immediately, even if he didn't know the individuals. Hard men, the kind who hired out for unpleasant work and asked no moral questions as long as the pay was adequate. The one in front was older, maybe 50, with a scarred face and eyes like chips of flint. The 2 behind him were younger, but no less dangerous looking, both carrying rifles across their saddles with the ease of men accustomed to using them. The older man reined in his horse a dozen paces from where Lokni stood, looking him up and down with obvious disdain. "You live here?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. Lokni nodded once, saying nothing. The man spat into the snow. "We're looking for a woman. White woman, blonde hair, about this tall." He gestured with his hand. "Ran away from Eureka about a month back. Her employer wants her found." "You seen anyone like that?" Lokni kept his face carefully neutral, his voice flat and uninterested when he spoke. "A woman came through maybe 3 weeks ago. She asked for water. I gave her some. She went north." The scarred man's eyes narrowed. "North where?" "Just north," Lokni said with a slight shrug. "I did not ask her plans. She did not tell me." The man studied him for a long moment, clearly trying to decide if he was lying. One of the younger men spoke up, his voice aggressive. "How do we know you're telling the truth, Indian? Maybe you got her stashed in that cabin. Maybe you figured to keep her for yourself." The words carried an ugly implication that made Lokni's jaw tighten, but he forced himself to remain calm. "You are welcome to search," he said evenly. "You will find nothing but one man's simple belongings." The older man dismounted, gesturing for the others to do the same. "Yeah, we'll do that," he said. "And you'll stand right here where we can see you while we look." Lokni watched as 2 of them entered his cabin, hearing them moving through his possessions with no regard for care or respect. The older man stayed outside, ostensibly watching Lokni, but really studying the area around the cabin, looking for any sign of recent activity beyond what one person would create. The snow had covered most tracks, but Lokni knew there might be small signs a careful observer could notice. He kept his breathing steady, his posture relaxed, giving away nothing. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes, the 2 searchers emerged from the cabin. "Nothing," one of them reported. "Just like he said, one man living alone. Some furs, dried meat, tools. No sign of a woman." The older man grunted, clearly disappointed. He turned back to Lokni. "This woman we're looking for, she stole money from her employer. Quite a bit of money. There's a reward for information leading to her recovery. $50 gold." "You sure you don't remember anything more specific about which way she went?" Lokni met his gaze steadily. "North," he repeated. "That is all I know. The reward does not interest me. I want no trouble. I simply want to be left alone." The scarred man stared at him a moment longer, then spat again. "Indians," he muttered with disgust. "You're all the same. Can't trust a word you say." He swung back into his saddle. "We'll be checking with other folks in the area. If we find out you lied, if we find out you're hiding her, we'll be back. And it won't be pleasant." The 3 men rode away, heading east along the river. Lokni remained motionless until the sound of their horses had faded completely, then allowed himself to release the breath he'd been holding. His hands, he realized, were shaking slightly from the adrenaline of controlled fear and anger. The way they'd spoken to him, the casual contempt and threats, reminded him why he'd chosen isolation over trying to exist in the white man's world. But more than his own humiliation, he felt rage at what they were doing. Hunting Alice like an animal for the crime of refusing to be victimized. He waited another hour, watching and listening to make sure the searchers didn't circle back, before finally allowing himself to relax fractionally. Then he set about preparing for the journey to the valley to retrieve Alice. The confrontation had gone as well as he could have hoped, but he knew it wasn't over. The men would continue searching, would question others who lived in the area. Eventually, someone might mention seeing smoke from his cabin at times that suggested more than one person's presence. Eventually, they might return with more men, more questions, more threats, but those were problems for another day. Right now, he needed to get to Alice, to tell her she was safe, to bring her home. He packed supplies quickly, including extra food and warmer blankets in case the weather turned worse. The sky had that heavy quality that promised snow, and the wind was picking up. They might end up staying in the valley for a day or two until it was safe to return. Better to be prepared. The journey to the valley took him longer than it had taken Alice, as he deliberately took a circuitous route, to make sure he wasn't being followed. The sun was past its zenith by the time he finally descended into the hidden vale, and what he saw made his chest tighten with a different kind of fear. Alice's fire had gone out, just a pile of dead coals remaining, and she was nowhere visible. For one terrible moment he thought something had happened to her, that he'd arrived too late. Then he saw her, pressed back into the deepest part of the overhang, her knife in her hand and her eyes wide with terror. She'd heard him approaching and assumed the worst. "Alice," he called softly. "It's me, you're safe." The transformation in her face was immediate and profound. The knife dropped from nerveless fingers and she launched herself at him, closing the distance between them in seconds, and throwing her arms around him with enough force to make him stagger. "You're alive," she gasped against his chest, her whole body shaking. "You're alive. I thought they'd hurt you. I thought they'd found out somehow and killed you." He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, feeling his own relief at finding her safe mixing with something deeper and more complicated. "I am fine," he murmured into her hair. "They searched the cabin but found nothing. They believed my story and left. You did well, Alice. You survived the night alone in winter. You should be proud." She pulled back enough to look up at him, and he saw that her face was streaked with partially frozen tears. "I was terrified," she admitted. "Every sound was them coming to find me. Every shadow was Webb's men. I've never been so frightened in my life." "That is the fear that keeps you alive," Lokni said gently, reaching up to wipe the tears from her cheeks with his thumb. "The fear that makes you careful, that keeps you alert. You did not let it paralyze you. You built fire, you ate, you stayed warm. That is survival." Alice leaned into his touch, her eyes searching his face. "What did they say? What did they want?" He told her about the confrontation, about the story of her going north, about the reward being offered. Her face paled at the mention of money for her capture. $50, she whispered. "That's more than most men make in 2 months. They'll keep looking. Everyone will keep looking for that kind of money." Lokni nodded grimly. "Yes, which means we need to be even more careful. But we have time now. They will search north first, following the story I gave them. They rebuilt the fire together, the familiar task helping to calm Alice's shaking hands and racing heart. As warmth spread through the sheltered space, she told him about her night, about the fears that had haunted her and the strength she'd found to push through them. He listened without interruption, understanding that she needed to speak it all aloud, to process the experience by sharing it. When she finished, he took her hands in his, warming them between his palms. "You are stronger than you know," he said quietly. "A month ago, you could not have survived a night alone in winter. Now you did it, and you are here, and you are whole. That strength is yours, Alice. No one gave it to you. You found it in yourself." She met his eyes, and something passed between them that went beyond words. A recognition and acknowledgement that had been building for weeks. "Lokni," she said softly, "I need to tell you something. I need to say it out loud even though I don't know if you feel the same way." He started to speak, but she pressed her fingers gently against his lips. "Please, let me say this. I've spent so much of my life afraid to speak what I really felt, afraid to be honest about what I wanted. I don't want to do that anymore. She took a breath, gathering courage. When I was lying here last night, thinking you might be hurt or killed, I realized something. I realized that these past weeks with you have been the happiest I've been in years. Maybe ever. Not despite the hardship and danger, but somehow because of it. Because for the first time in my life, I'm not playing a role or meeting someone else's expectations. I'm just being myself. And you see me, really see me, and you don't. Ask me to be anything different. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. I know the world would say this is wrong. That we're from different worlds and shouldn't be together. I know there are practical dangers and real threats. But I also know that I'm falling in love with you, Lokni. Maybe I have been since the moment you lifted me out of that river. And if we're going to face danger anyway, I'd rather face it together, as partners who care for each other, than as two people pretending there's nothing between us. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the wind moving through the valley. Lokni's dark eyes searched her face, and she saw a storm of emotions there that matched what she felt in her own chest. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with feeling. Alice Pritchard, you terrify me. Not because of danger you bring, but because of what I feel when I look at you. Because somewhere in the past month you became necessary to me in a way I never expected. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch infinitely gentle. I have lived alone for 3 years by choice, telling myself that solitude was safety, that not caring meant not hurting. But you walked into my life half drowned and desperate, and somehow you opened something in me I thought was closed forever. I do not know if what I feel is love. I have no experience with that word to know for certain. But I know that when those men came today, my greatest fear was not for myself, but for you. I know that the thought of you leaving feels like losing something essential. Then don't make me leave, Alice whispered, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Let me stay. Let me be your partner in this life you've built. Teach me everything you know, and I'll pull my own weight. We can face whatever comes together. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, and she saw the exact moment he made his decision, saw the walls he'd built around himself finally crumble. Yes, he said simply. Yes to all of it. Whatever time we have, however long the world allows us to be together, I want it. I want you. And then he was kissing her, and she was kissing him back, and everything else fell away except the two of them and the fire and the valley that held them safe. It was a kiss that tasted of survival and hope, of wounds beginning to heal and futures being rewritten. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, the world had shifted somehow, becoming larger and smaller simultaneously. They spent the rest of that day and the following night in the valley, talking and planning and slowly learning the language of being together as something more than survival partners. They discussed practical matters, how to make the cabin more secure for winter with 2 people, how to expand their food stores, how to stay alert for further searchers. But they also talked about deeper things, sharing stories from their pasts, dreams for possible futures, fears they'd never spoken aloud before. The storm they'd both sensed building finally arrived on the second day, dumping fresh snow that made travel back to the cabin temporarily impossible. They didn't mind. The valley felt like their own private world, cut off from everything that threatened or judged. They spent hours by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence, learning the rhythms of being together. Lokni taught Alice songs from his childhood, melodies that had been sung by his people for generations. Alice taught him card games her father had shown her, using a battered deck Lokni had traded for years ago but never learned to use. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm broke and the sky cleared to brilliant blue. They packed their belongings and began the journey back to the cabin, moving through a landscape transformed by 2 feet of fresh snow. Everything was clean and white and sparkling in the sunlight, the world reborn and full of possibility. They walked side by side, their snowshoes leaving parallel tracks, and Alice thought about how those tracks represented something important. Two paths, separate but together, moving in the same direction. When the cabin came into view through the trees, it looked different to Alice's eyes. Before it had been shelter, sanctuary, the place where she'd healed. Now it was home in a deeper sense, the place she'd chosen to build a life with someone she loved. The thought should have terrified her given everything that still threatened. But instead she felt a fierce joy that burned away the fear. Whatever came next, they would face it together that evening. As they settled back into the cabin's familiar rhythms, Lokni pulled out a small bundle he'd kept hidden. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a necklace made of blue and white. Beads in a pattern that matched the beadwork on the knife sheath he'd given her. "My mother made this," he said softly. "She wore it on the day she married my father. I want you to have it, Alice. Not as a marriage in the way your people understand it, for we have no priest and no law would recognize such a union between us. But as a promise between two people who choose each other despite everything." Alice took the necklace with shaking hands, feeling the weight of history and hope it carried. She fastened it around her neck, and Lokni smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "It suits you," he said, "like it was made for you." She touched the beads, feeling their smooth surfaces, understanding that she was being given not just a piece of jewelry, but acceptance into something larger than herself. Outside, the winter. Wind sang through the pines, and the river ran dark beneath its coating of ice. Inside, two people who should have been strangers held each other close, building warmth against the cold, defying all the forces that would keep them apart. The world would continue to threaten, to judge, to hunt. But for tonight, and for all the nights they could steal, they had each other. And that was enough. Winter deepened its hold on the mountains, and with it came a transformation that went beyond the weather. Alice and Lokni settled into a partnership that balanced survival with something neither had expected to find again: genuine happiness. The cabin that had once housed a solitary man now held two people who moved through their days with the synchronized ease of those who understand each other without needing constant words. They woke before dawn most mornings, the fire built up. Together, breakfast prepared with hands that knew their tasks, and then the work of winter survival that filled every daylight hour. Alice had become proficient in ways that would have astonished the frightened woman who'd collapsed in the river 2 months earlier. She could track game through snow, set and check trap lines without assistance, skin and preserve meat with efficiency that wasted nothing. Her hands, once soft and uncertain, now worked with confidence whether wielding her knife or weaving baskets from materials Lokni showed her how to harvest and prepare. She'd learned to read the forest's moods, to predict when storms approached, to find food and medicine in a landscape that appeared barren to untrained eyes. But more than skills, she'd found something deeper. A sense of belonging that had nothing to do with place and everything to do with person. In Lokni's presence she felt wholly herself in ways she'd never experienced before, not performing or pretending, but simply being. Their conversations ranged from practical matters to philosophy, from shared laughter over small domestic mishaps to serious discussions about the future. He treated her as an equal partner whose thoughts and opinions mattered, whose strength was recognized and respected. The threat of discovery never fully disappeared, always present like a shadow at the edge of their awareness. Twice more during that long winter, searchers passed through the area, though none came as close to the cabin as that first group. Each time, Alice would retreat to the valley or hide in other locations Lokni had identified, places where she could wait safely until danger passed. Each separation was difficult, marked by worry and the acute awareness of how much they'd come to depend on each other's presence. But between those moments of tension, life took on a rhythm that felt almost normal. They celebrated the winter solstice in the tradition of Lokni's people, marking the return of longer days with ceremony and gratitude. Alice learned the songs and stories of his culture, listening with fascination to tales that went back generations, understanding that he was sharing his heritage with her in ways that required deep trust. In return, she taught him things from her own background, sharing recipes her mother had taught her and stories from her childhood that she'd thought she'd forgotten. One particularly cold evening in late January, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Lokni spoke of something that had clearly been weighing on his mind. "Spring will come eventually," he said quietly. "When it does, the high passes will open again. Travel will become easier. Webb's men will have more range to search." Alice felt her stomach tighten at the unspoken question beneath his words. "You're asking if I've thought about leaving," she said. He met her eyes directly. "I am asking if you want to stay. Truly stay, not just until spring, but beyond. To make this life permanent, knowing what it means. We would always be looking over our shoulders, always ready to run or hide. You would be giving up any chance of returning to the world you came from, of living openly without fear. That is a heavy choice, Alice. I need to know you understand what you would be choosing." Alice set down the basket she'd been weaving and moved to sit beside him, taking his hand in hers. "I've had months to think about this," she said firmly. "Months to understand what staying means and what leaving would cost. Yes, this life is hard. Yes, there's danger and uncertainty. But I've lived in that other world, Lokni. I've been respectable and proper, and done everything society expected of me. And I was miserable. Here, with you, I'm free in ways I never knew existed. I choose this. I choose you. Every single day, I choose this life." Relief washed visibly across his face, followed by something deeper that looked like joy. "Then we plan for permanence," he said. "We prepare not just to survive, but to build something lasting. There are things we need to do, changes to make. The cabin should be expanded before next winter. We need more storage, better defenses. And we should make contact with my cousins in Oregon, the ones I mentioned before. Not to leave, but to establish connections with others who live outside the system. Community, even scattered and hidden, makes survival more certain." They spent the remaining winter months planning and preparing for a future that felt both exciting and daunting. As the snow began to melt and the first signs of spring appeared, they worked on expanding the cabin, adding a second room that would serve as storage and workspace. Lokni taught Alice advanced skills she'd need for the warmer months, including how to preserve foods for the next winter, how to garden in the small cleared spaces around the cabin, how to make the medicines and tools they'd need to be truly self-sufficient. In early March, as the ice broke up on the river and the world began its annual resurrection, they received unexpected news. A Modoc man, traveling north to visit family, stopped at their cabin seeking shelter for a night. Over dinner, he shared information that made both Alice and Lokni sit up with sharp attention. Garrett Webb had died 3 weeks earlier, killed in a dispute with a miner over a card game. The Silver Star Saloon had been sold to new owners who had no interest in Webb's personal vendettas. The searchers, the man continued, had given up months ago. The reward had been withdrawn after Webb's death. No one was looking for a runaway saloon girl anymore. The world had moved on. Alice felt something release in her chest that she hadn't fully realized she'd been holding. The primary threat, the sword that had hung over them all winter, was gone. Webb couldn't hurt her anymore. She was truly free that night. After their guest had settled into sleep, Alice and Lokni stood outside under a sky brilliant with stars. So Lokni said softly, "You could leave now if you wanted. Go back to towns and people. Find an easier life than this one." Alice laughed, the sound carrying clearly in the cold night air. "And give up daily adventures with you. Give up this place we've built together." "Not a chance," she turned to face him, her expression serious despite her light tone. "I meant what I said, Lokni. I choose this life not because I have no other options, but because this is where I want to be. With you, building something that's ours." She gestured at the cabin, the forest, the river running silver in the moonlight. "This is my home now. You are my home." Nothing about Webb's death changes that Lokni pulled her close, and they stood together looking out at the landscape they'd learned to read and love. Spring was coming, bringing with it new challenges and new possibilities. They would plant gardens and repair winter damage. They would make contact with his cousins, carefully building a network of others who lived on society's margins. They would continue learning and growing, both individually and together. The path ahead wasn't easy, but it was theirs. Chosen freely by two people who'd found in each other something worth every hardship. As the weeks passed and spring truly arrived, the forest around them exploded into life. Flowers bloomed in impossible profusion, animals emerged from winter sleep, and birds returned from their southern journeys, filling the air with song. Alice and Lokni worked from dawn to dusk, planting, building, preparing for the year ahead. But they also took time to simply enjoy the world around them. To walk through the forest hand in hand, to swim in the river as it warmed, to lie in the meadow near the hidden valley and watch clouds drift across the sky. One evening in late April, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, they sat on the porch Lokni had built onto the front of the cabin. Alice leaned against him, his arm around her shoulders, both of them tired from a long day's work, but content in a way that went bone deep. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Taking me in that day? Changing your whole life because of one choice?" Lokni was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. Then he spoke, his voice firm and clear. "I regret nothing. You asked me once why I helped you. I said it was the right thing to do. But the truth is deeper than that. I think some part of me recognized you that day in the river. Recognized a kindred spirit, someone who understood what it meant to be alone and desperate and still fighting. Saving you meant saving something in myself I thought was lost." He tightened his arm around her. "You brought life back to this place, Alice. Not just your presence, but your spirit. Your strength and humor and stubborn refusal to give up. Every day with you is a gift I never expected to receive. So no, I do not regret it. I would make the same choice 1,000 times over." Alice felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. She turned to kiss him, pouring into that kiss everything she felt but couldn't quite put into words. Gratitude and love and hope and commitment. When they pulled apart, the sun had finished setting, leaving them in the soft twilight that preceded full darkness. They sat together as the stars emerged one by one, the same stars that had watched over them through the long winter, through danger and fear and the slow building of trust and love. Tomorrow would bring its own work and challenges. The life they'd chosen demanded constant effort and vigilance. But tonight, there was peace. Tonight, there was home. Two people who'd been lost had found each other against all odds, and in finding each other had discovered that sometimes the most difficult paths lead to the most beautiful destinations. The river sang its eternal song below them, and the forest whispered its secrets to the wind. Inside the cabin, their home, a fire burned steady and warm. And two hearts, once broken by the world's cruelty, had mended in each other's presence, becoming stronger at the broken places. Alice Pritchard and Lokni, bound by choice rather than circumstance, by love rather than obligation, faced whatever future awaited them together. And that made all the difference.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.